Okay, so welcome everyone, good evening, and we're going to be talking about Chapter 3 of the book, and I asked people to look at the chart, and I think Michael emailed a copy of the chart from page 81 out to everyone. So, in the social sciences, the history of social science, in social theory, people often refer to what's called the tradition of suspicion. Even rhymes a bit. The tradition of suspicion. And many of our major Western philosophers and sociologists have contributed to this tradition. Karl Marx, certainly. I mean, you know, he's trying to help us see through what he calls false consciousness, so that we can begin to understand the operation of economic forces underneath. He's trying to help us see beyond class consciousness. And he's helping us try to see beyond ideology, a whole system of rationalizations that justify a particular economic and social system. So that's Marxism. Friedrich Nietzsche, major contributor to the tradition of suspicion. You know, he's seeing the will to power behind what is presented as, you know, disinterested, ethically grounded action. The Genealogy of Morals is like a really important contribution to the tradition of suspicion. I mean, basically he thinks that the Judeo-Christian ethic in which the meek shall inherit the earth is precisely a moral system unconsciously constructed to make the powerful feel guilty for their power. So that they will then, I mean, we can't beat them in a straight-ahead fight, but if we make them guilty, they'll fall on their own swords. So it's a brilliant contribution to guilt induction. And of course, Nietzsche said this was the genius of the Jews, was to come up with this philosophy, and then it was taken over by Christians and certainly by feminists and by, well, everybody. If you can get your opponent to feel guilty for being strong, well, you can have him or her for breakfast, because they can't fight. They can't fight. I mean, look, we see this in marriages. I see this going on in marriages all of the time. I mean, if one partner is filled with guilt, then he can't defend himself, right? I mean, his hands are tied behind his back. I mean, he just can't. But if you get free of your guilt, if you get out from under the guilt induction, it's incredible how powerful you can then become. You can actually take care of yourself, prevent yourself from being abused, because you're not crippled by a need to be dominated and punished and so on and so forth. Guilt induction. So that's Nietzsche, tradition of suspicion. Sigmund Freud, obviously, trying to help us get beyond self-deception and rationalizations and come to understand the drive going on beneath the defense. He's trying to help us get beyond the manifest content to the latent content. The whole discipline of sociology has always identified with the tradition of suspicion. You know, so it's very like psychoanalysis in this way. A sociologist will go into an organization, and up on the wall of the president's office is the organizational chart, the president and then 3 vice presidents governing various divisions and so on and so on. This is the way authority is supposed to work in this in this company. The sociologist goes in and hangs around for a while and realizes that the person really running the corporation is the president's secretary, who's been there for 45 years, and she knows where all the bodies are buried, and she knows, and she's got dirt on everyone just, she's really running. So organizations often just don't behind the scenes. Sociologist wants to get behind the scenes. So this is all the tradition of suspicion. And that's a disillusioning tradition. I mean, the whole point of this type of science is to free us from illusions. You know, it was the book that brought me, I think, into psychoanalysis in the first place. I think I was around 14 or 15, and I spotted a little book on my dad's bedside table. He was delivering babies during the day, but he was a frustrated intellectual. He'd read till 2 in the morning. He read really good stuff, but he was reading, it was Erich Fromm, Beyond the Chains of Illusion, My Encounter with Marx and Freud was the title of the book. And I just ate that up, and it kind of defined for me what I wanted to do. But on the other hand, there is a need. People have a need for illusions. And Winnicott famously says, and I quote him in this chapter, that the mother has a double task. First, she has to illusion the infant, and only after the infant has been successfully illusioned can her second task of disillusionment make any sense. And so that's sort of where I take off. And I think what he says there is very important for therapists to understand. I mean, you might be lucky as a therapist and start off with some fairly well put together neurotic patients, and they don't need much illusioning. But even they, I think, need some. Well, of course they need some, because even though they're operating on the level of the depressive position and they're neurotic, they may still need to idealize the analyst to a considerable degree, far less so than a patient functioning in the paranoid schizoid position, but they still want to endow their analyst with qualities that are probably not exactly justified by his dismal, all-too-human reality, which the patient will find out about sooner or later. In later stages of the analysis, they will discover his frailties and his errors and his flaws and his faults, but maybe at the beginning they don't want to cope with that, and they shouldn't have to cope with it. You know, they need to endow him with a certain magic, even neurotic patients. I often cynically thought that that's why we are relatively silent, because we don't want to prematurely disillusion them by having them see how flawed we actually are, so it's a good idea to shut up. You know, the couch helps because they're not staring at us, and so the magic can start to unfold, the transference can start to unfold. Okay, patients need illusioning, especially the more disturbed patients. So if your technique is a disillusioning technique, you're not going to be, if it's thoroughly disillusioning, you're not going to be able to work with very disturbed people. And that may be your decision. I mean, we have the right to choose the kind of practices that we want, and if I don't want to work with paranoid schizoid or borderline or psychotic patients, I should have the right to. But I'm really restricting my practice. I mean, if I want to work with a broader spectrum of pathology, I'm going to have to not come on consistently in the disillusionist vein. I'm going to have to be open to illusioning technique.
But even every patient functioning in a relatively mature way will produce phenomena of the schizoparanoid position.
Absolutely.
Sometimes consistently.
Right.
Because is part of the makeup.
Right.
Don,
yes.
An example of illusioning a patient, please.
Allowing the patient to make me into God.
But you are not illusioning the patient. You are allowing the patient.
I'm allowing the patient to illusion himself. I'm not telling him I'm God, but I'm not throwing cold water in his face either.
Okay. So you're talking really like talking about optimal disillusionment. You have to let them idealize or over-idealize you until they are ready to be disillusioned.
Yes, yes. And that is a major contribution of Kohut's, because a lot of the older Freudians were very uncomfortable being idealized or idolized. I make a distinction between idealization and idolization. I think idealization can take place in the depressive position, but in the paranoid schizoid position, we don't just get idealized, we get idolization. I mean, it's a real God-making process with all kinds of magical properties. It's just more severe. But Kohut tried to get colleagues to hold off on the disillusionment, even though the analyst is very uncomfortable, because, look, the analyst has spent 10 years in his own training analysis trying to come to grips with the terrible reality that he's not God. Okay? And now he's got patients who are telling him he is. And that's very uncomfortable for him, because it tempts him to go back into his narcissistic state that he's struggled to get free of. And so he's inclined to say to the patient, come on, wake up, I'm not... Kohut says, no, we should sit with it. We should sit with it, because the patient needs to go through this process. So that process of sitting with it is what I'm calling illusioning. But you're right, we're not promoting, we're just allowing it to be, rather than stifling it or rejecting it. But Alex, you were making the point, though, that even with neurotic level patients, because all of us oscillate between PS and D, no one operates in D all the time, we're oscillating throughout the day from minute to minute sometimes. Yes. And so we're going to have plenty of illusions and plenty of magical stuff going on, even in well put together neurotic patients, right?
But it also happens in every interpretation, because in order to listen to an interpretation, the patient has to feel understood.
Yes.
That's the empathic moment. And at that moment, you are a wonderful character that understands.
Yes, yes.
But then you come down with something that the patient doesn't see and doesn't like.
Yes.
And the disillusion happens.
There's the disillusionment moment. Yes.
Balint, I think it was Balint who said, you have to hold the patient with one hand and punch
with the other. Right. And of course, the reason that I'm laying this out in this chart is that I'm critical of colleagues who only punch and colleagues who only hold.
Exactly.
I agree with Balint. That is proper analytic technique, holding and punching, and then holding again. But the field has really divided. These two tendencies have separated. And of course, this both and, holding and punching, that's what I'm calling a dialectical move. Both sides now, not thesis exclusively, not antithesis, but going back and forth between these two techniques. And so timing is so important. The analyst, this is where experience comes in. You have to know when to hold. You have to know when to hold them and when to fold them. That's the art of psychoanalysis, right? To be able to punch, but not overly punch, and to then reestablish the holding, and then not hold too long before you punch again. The art of but people get stuck, only holding, only punching, with terrible consequences. I mean, the patients go away, or the patients are wounded. Or the patients are drawn into a religion, which isn't psychoanalysis anymore. It's all idealization and idolization, or demonization, or because they can demonize, obviously, as much as they can idealize, but then you're into some kind of quasi-religious cult then, if there's no punching, if there's no disillusioning. And I think there's a lot of this in our field. I think it's malpractice to allow that to happen. Now, I think it's inevitable to happen at times, to a degree. In every analysis, we're never just, I always think of sailing. Because in sailing, you want to be as close to the wind as you can, but if you're too close to the wind, you go into irons. If you're too far from the wind, you're not using the wind fully. And what you have to do is you tack. You know, you don't go in a straight line. You can't. You have to, it's constant self-correction. I think that's what good analytic technique is, constant self-correction between these two poles. So, illusioning and disillusioning. The illusioning I called the therapies of faith, as opposed to the therapies of doubt. Of course, there has to be faith for the therapy to even get off the ground. And sometimes I don't think we pay enough attention to this. I mean, patients bring their fragile psyches into a room with us. They've never met us before. They know very little about us. How can they trust us? It amazes me, actually, how people are able to come in and how much they're able to risk trust when they don't know me from Adam. And so many therapists, some considerable number, turn out to be untrustworthy, corrupt, fake, fraudulent. I mean, Freud said that the practice of psychotherapy is one of those fields where a sense of fraudulence is always haunting us. We never entirely overcome because we're working in a very murky area, and do we know what we're doing, and is what we're doing really real? And but some therapists are fraudulent. They really don't know what they're doing, and they're sitting back and collecting their fees, and what the hell? But so a lot of patients place their trust when they shouldn't. They're under paranoid. You know, you can be over paranoid, you can be under paranoid. But there has to be faith, otherwise the therapy can't get off the ground. I like it when patients, right at the beginning, I had that experience recently. Someone started with me, and I had known this person in a different context before, and so when he came to be and I accepted him as a patient, in the first session I had trouble shifting gears completely and realizing, okay, he's now a patient, because he used to be in a different kind of relationship with me. So I was very casual in that first session. And after this one session, he sent me an email just blasting me. Deeply hostile and devaluing, and how disillusioned he was, and he had admired me, but what the hell did I think I was doing? And I thought, oh my God, he's borderline. No, he was just really deeply disillusioned with the way I behaved in this initial session, and he was acting out by communicating outside the session in an email. And anyway, we resumed, and I didn't retaliate. I initially felt angry and attacked, but that calmed down quickly, and by the time I saw him, I was calm, and I didn't retaliate, and we resumed, and we began to talk about it, and it turned out, no, it's not borderline. He had a very strong reaction, and we got past it, and therapeutic trust has been building ever since, and we're starting to work well together. I'm surprised at acting out that quick and so severely. I thought, oh my God, you know, what am I dealing with here? But it turns out I'm dealing with a person who didn't want to waste his time. Has had a lot of therapy before and doesn't want to waste his time on a therapy that's doesn't look like it's gonna go right. And let me know in no uncertain terms. And I pulled my act together, and we're going on. I like it when patients can do that. Okay, another way of characterizing this division is Gnostic versus Agnostic. Gnostic meaning is from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. So here, the therapy is about the patient learning about himself or herself. Whereas the other approach is agnostic. It's not so much about the patient learning things as the patient becoming very skeptical about everything. So this is a therapy of doubt, agnostic therapy, not a therapy of belief. In other words, is the cure a conversion to a new vision of reality? Or is the cure a conversion to a new vision of myself? Is that what I get from therapy? A whole new view of myself? Or do I walk away from therapy doubting every vision of myself? Being skeptical and agnostic towards every vision of myself, because they're all lies. Any vision, you never get the true. You never get the truth. You never get the true vision of yourself. You walk away from therapy with an enhanced capacity to be skeptical. Certainly the Lacanians would agree with this. Because for Lacan, any vision we have of ourselves is what he calls the specular ego, the self-image. And for him, this is the problem. You know, in the mirror stage, we form this idol, this image of ourselves, and it dominates us, and we spend our lives trying to polish it. Meanwhile, life is slipping through our fingers because that thing is a dead idol. It's not the living. It's not the true self. It's an illusion. So the Lacanian theory is quite agnostic. It's very much a disillusioning therapy. And this is why Lacanians, Freudians, and Kleinians basically can talk to one another. They're all on the side. They lean towards disillusion. Lacanians, Freudians, and Kleinians. They've got a lot in common. As opposed to self and relational and intersubjective theorists. Now, there's some cross here. They don't line up perfectly, but... Okay, constructionist versus deconstructionist. The constructionist is illusioning. They may be constructing a new self. You know, it's interesting. Cohen's first book was called The Analysis of the Self. The second book was called The Restoration of the Self. Analysis sounds disillusioning. Construction, the resurrection, no, restoration, the restoration of the self, that sounds constructionist. So that's a real difference. The deconstructionist approach is not, I'm not putting together a new self. I'm not walking in with a fragmented self, to use the language of self-psychology. I'm not walking in with a fragmented self and then walking out with an integrated self. I'm not walking in not knowing who I am, but walking out knowing who I am. A deconstructionist has this ongoing, he has this feeling that he ongoingly needs to be suspicious and deconstructing his theories of himself. He shares something with Buddhism here. Okay, the disillusioning approaches have something in common with Buddhism. The self is an idol that ongoingly needs to be deconstructed. Okay, then we have identifying versus disidentifying. Now here there is some crossover. The idea of the cure as involving identification with the analyst is shared across a number of the schools, including ego psychology, I think, to some degree. Certainly it's there in self-psychology. Kohut talks about transmuting internalization of the analyst. The analyst is established as an empathic, good object, affectively attuned self-object, and this empathic self-object is internalized, and this is how I construct myself and overcome fragmentation. I internalize. Now, here again is a meeting between Klein and Kohut, because that's very similar to Klein's idea that the cure involves the building up of a good internal object. When I recognized that, I then had to realize I've got a bit of a problem with the Kleinian theory of cure. I was putting that whole idea more onto Kohut, but there it is in Klein too, the building up of a good internal object. I think there's truth in it. I don't want to be seen as saying that all of the truth is on the deconstructionist side, and I certainly am not saying there's no truth in the constructionist side. I'm saying we need to work both sides of this street. So maybe it's not a problem for me that Klein and Kohut agree, because maybe they agree on something true here, that a part of the cure is the internalization of the analyst as a good object. I think that's part of the cure. I think that's a part of the cure. People used to debate what is it, the relationship or the insight? Well, clearly it's both. I mean, an analyst who gives you an empathically attuned and true interpretation, he's helping you not only by giving you the interpretation, you're being helped by the fact that he's in tune with you. And he cares enough about you to try to help you by giving you this true interpretation. So he's a good object, giving you good interpretations. He's giving you a good feed. An interpretation is a feed. He's feeding you. It's giving you a good feed. That's the relationship. Relationship is part of the cure. There's no doubt about it. I think it's really a mistake to try to reduce the cure just to insight and self-knowledge. No. Some people, in the analysis, they encounter the best relationship that they have ever had in their lives. They've had a lot of bad relationships, but they meet a good analyst and they have a good relationship, and that's very healing in and of itself, aside from any knowledge that's acquired.
But it's necessary for insight to work. Without a good relationship, insight is useless.
Absolutely, I agree. I agree.
You know? Yeah. So the relationship has to come before the insight starts.
Yes, which is why following Greenson and others, we talk about building a therapeutic alliance.
Absolutely.
At the beginning, it's essential. And
this is something.
Sure.
About this, I think there's a distinction. I don't know if it's between the Bayonian school and the ego psychologist, between identifying or getting identified with the function of the analyst versus getting identified with the analyst as a whole person.
Yes, absolutely. That's a crucial distinction. Thanks for raising that. Yes, identifying with the function of the analyst. The analyst's, one identifies with the kinds of questions that the analyst raises. If I were with my analyst, I'm having an experience of some kind. If I was telling my analyst about this, what kind of questions would he be raising? How would he be approaching this issue? What would he ask? What would he pay attention to? Yeah, that's identifying with the analyst's function. Some people define the goal of analysis as developing in the analysand a capacity for self-analysis. When you've internalized the analyst's function to such an extent that you can analyze yourself well, then you kind of don't need the analyst.
And that's one termination, the indication for termination.
Yes. Yeah, I think it was Bolus who said that. Yeah, it's an indication for termination. But then all kinds of interesting things happen. I've been working with a guy for a number of years, quite a number of years, and he's done very well in his analysis, and the symptoms are cured, and he's doing well in his profession, and he's in a good marriage, and basically, what's preventing him from terminating? This is what we've been talking about for about the last year or so. Why does he not terminate? Well, because I'm the closest thing he's ever had to a good dad. And he doesn't want to give this connection up. But it's more complicated than that. It's that if he gives it up, he's then living in a world without dads. Which means he's flying solo now. Which means he has to take responsibility for his life. And there's a loneliness. He feels that as a kind of a loneliness, not as a liberation. I mean, a lot of patients are real eager to end the analysis and fly solo because they feel humiliated by still needing a dad. But he doesn't want to do without a dad. The idea of being a man, adult man in the world without dads. Of course, you know, I try to tell him that you don't have to be without elders. You don't have to be without mentors. I acquired a mentor when I was like 65 years of age, and he helped me enormously. But nevertheless, he doesn't want to let go. That's what we're working on.
A story about identifying with your analyst, or his function, or his person, or both. Right. I mean, ideally, it should be idealization with function.
Yes, yes.
Not a ginger cook. But I was in a workshop in New York that was led by Ackerman. Ackerman was an analyst.
Nathan Ackerman.
Yeah. And at the end of the workshop, he said to me, just a minute, do you know Nate Epstein? Nate Epstein was my analyst.
Okay.
And it was his analysis.
Ah.
He picked it up.
He picked it up. He saw the identification.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
I was stunned.
Right. Well,
and he was. When I told him, he's my analyst. You know, it was an amazing experience. You know?
He could hear it in your voice or your mannerisms. Listen, when I first started attending meetings of the Toronto Psychoanalytic Society back in the early mid-1970s or something, we were meeting in the boardroom at the top of the Clark Institute of Psychiatry, and there were no women. It was all men. And the first guy would arrive, and smoking was still happening, so the first guy would arrive and he'd light a cigar, being Freud identified. And then the next guy would arrive and he'd light a cigar. And by the time the meeting was half through, you couldn't see the guys on the other side of the table for the cigar smoke hanging in the air, okay? There was no women. And then finally a woman arrived, that would have been Pat White, arrived, and then smoking was banned and gone within a year. And everything changed, right? But you could clearly tell certain of the colleagues from their mannerisms and the way they dressed, their style of dress and whatever. It was very much.
You would have needed Anna Siegel because she smoked cigars.
Anna Freud. There you go.
No, Anna Siegel.
Oh, Siegel. Hannah Siegel smoked cigars. Right, I knew that, actually. Yeah, that's interesting. Right. Lacan is scathing about the idea. He says anyone writing about the cure, the psychoanalytic cure, who mentions identification with the analyst, in that very way betrays a total lack of understanding of what psychoanalysis is about, says Lacan. Now, of course, he says things in a very extreme way, but he's got a point. He's saying, you know, we're not out to create mini-me's. And if that's what the person walks away with, is that kind of, one thing to identify with the analyst's function. I'm talking about a more global identification with the analyst. That's got to be a major defense against all kinds of things, probably against rage and anger towards the analyst, because I have learned that one of the best, most common defenses against hating someone or knowing that you hate them is to identify with them. And when you start disidentifying from the person, the identification is replaced with anger and hostility, because the identification was like a cork in the bottle. And so I think a lot of identification is that. Some of it is just a failure of separation and individuation. It's a cloaking yourself in the magic. I mean, so-called, quotes, primitive people kill the bear and then they dress up in the bear skin and the head of the bear. Well, I mean, if you're terrified of your analyst, maybe you try to become him. All kinds of defensive functions. But Lacan really was hostile to identification of that global sort. Identifying and disidentifying. Okay. Then on the constructionist side, the faith side, we have therapy through inspiration as opposed to therapy through interpretation. Synthetic versus analytic kind of cure. Therapy through inspiration. I mean, I think there's a role for inspiration in all good therapy, but if that's the main ingredient, that somehow you are inspired, and maybe that then goes with a more global identification with the person who inspires you. This is therapy as joining a cult. Being inspired and joining the cult. Again, I don't rule it out entirely. I certainly was inspired by my first analyst. I sought analysis for personal reasons, not because I wanted to train. I had no idea of training, but I fell in love with my analyst and was majorly inspired by him. And that formed a part of my desire, but it was only a part. Another part of my becoming an analyst was a belated identification with my doctor father, whom I had disidentified with when I dropped out of pre-meds. And now I'm identifying with him again by moving into a therapeutic profession where, like him, I would have patients. But I was pretty inspired by my first analyst. He was an inspiring guy. And that was useful for me. You know, because like I arrived with a writer's block. I couldn't write my PhD. And within a few months of being inspired by this guy, I was writing. Then decided to join his profession. So it has a role. Inspiration does have a role in therapeutic process. But we hope for a lot more than that. Interpretation. I mean, he didn't just inspire me, but he gave me interpretations, some of which really hit the mark. I mean, he saw me, and he told me what he saw, and it hit home. And on a number of occasions, I experienced what I've come to think of as psychogenic stupidity. He would be trying to tell me something true, some truth, very simple truth. And he was not a man, he was not a windy guy, you know. He used short, direct sentences. And he would say something truthful, as simple as 2 + 2 = 4. And do you think I could get it? I just would go stupid on his couch and I couldn't. What did you say? Can you run that by me again? Like he's... I just couldn't get it. I've encountered that with books, too. Certainly when early, years ago, when Kernberg's Borderline Conditions and Pathological Narcissism came out. Ah, man, I could hardly read that book. It was just too close to home. I think it just created such anxiety, what he was saying. I had to put the book aside. A few years later, I went back after more analysis, was able to read it. Okay, on the constructionist side, we have Empathic Inquiry, which is working largely on the conscious and preconscious level. I think a lot of the relational, intersubjective people, I think there's not much on conscious. I think their approach is pretty restricted to the level of conscious and preconscious empathic attunement. I'm probably being unfair in saying that, but I think on the deconstructionist side, we're really interested in insight into the unconscious processes. We want to listen with the third ear. We don't want to just do manifest content therapy. I mean, manifest content therapy, that's not what Freudians, Kleinians, and Lacanians are about. We're after the unconscious. I'm remembering a discussion I had with Howard Bacall, who supervised my third case, and he was British trained, but a major self-psychologist, but he knew all of the different schools because he trained in England. And he was in Toronto for a number of years, then he went to California. But he was supervising my third case, and he was talking about the need for the analyst to be in empathic contact with the patient. That is, the analyst needs to decenter from his own perspective and immerse himself as best he can empathically in the perspective of the patient. And I remember saying to him, but which patient? I mean, what's Freud's discovery? We're all multiple. There is no one patient. There's at least two. And then he stretches it to three, id, ego, superego, and then I added conscience and ego. I mean, look, we're all these internal objects. So my patient is trying to convince me that the only way that I can cure her is to sleep with her. And that's what she's telling me. And I'm empathizing with her perspective. But I'm also listening to her unconscious. She's bringing all kinds of dreams and slips and indicating in a million ways that basically she's praying, please don't be seduced by me. Please be a good daddy. Please maintain boundaries. So which of these two patients should I be empathizing with? Well, obviously both. But this illusion that there's one patient and your task is to empathize, that there is no one patient. And therefore empathy is far more complex than a lot of people in the self-psychology tradition seem to think of it. It's so complex. It requires awareness of the unconscious. So empathic inquiry versus insight into the unconscious. That's a real different emphasis. Although, obviously, again, both are necessary. I need to empathize with where the patient is at consciously and not just address their unconscious. I need to indicate to them that I'm listening to what they're saying consciously, preconsciously, as well as unconsciously. Okay, here's a big difference. People in the Therapies of Faith, they're very much emphasizing empathy as an end in itself. Empathy as curative in and of itself. And I think it is to some degree. We've talked about that already. I mean, I think empathy is healing, soothing, but for them, empathy is almost an end in itself, as opposed to the Deconstructionist approach, which sees empathy as a means to promote insight. Obviously, insight depends on empathy. Obviously, Freudians, Kleinians, and Lacanians need to be empathic. But there's a difference between empathy seen as a healing thing in and of itself, which it is to some degree, I think, as opposed to this is a means rather than an end in itself. It's a means at getting at something hidden, something important that's hidden, that needs to come out, that needs to be brought to light. Okay, validating experience, the validation of the patient's experience. Yeah, sure.
I've always had trouble with the notion of empathy as an emotional state. I am very curious and interested, I think, in my clients.
Mm-hmm.
And I could say, yeah, I'm interested in what you're saying. I may not necessarily believe it, of course.
Sure.
I'm certainly interested in.
Yeah.
So I suppose I'm possibly faking it as empathy. It's just my interest coming out.
Well, okay, but I mean, I don't see a conflict there. If you're interested in someone, that makes you already empathic. Because what do we mean by empathy? Oh, here, I'm glad you raised that. The American philosopher George Herbert Mead had this huge influence on sociology and social psychology, and he distinguished two poles of the self, the I and the me. And the I is the subject, and the me is the self-image or the self-concept. Okay, we're talking about empathy. And Mead referred to role-taking. Role-taking is simply me imagining myself in your shoes and imagining what you're feeling. George Herbert Mead, role-taking. Empathy is merely a cognitive act. It's not sympathy. It's empathy. So a psychopath, if he's any good, is highly empathic. Because he has to put himself in your shoes to know what words you have to hear to open your wallet and hand all the money to him.
Okay.
Okay? So empathy in itself is just cognitive imagining being in the other person's shoes. Sympathy is quite different. Sympathy is knowing how you feel and caring because you're in pain. And sympathy then is not only, it's caring and it's wanting to help. It's wanting to relieve your suffering. But empathy and sympathy are two different things. Psychopaths are highly empathic and unsympathetic. You know? So when you say you're interested in your patients, I think that's empathy. You can't be interested without... I mean, that's why you're interested, because you're empathic. You get a sense of what they're feeling, and you're interested in what they're feeling, and you want to hear more about what they're feeling.
I think I was reading more emotion into empathy.
Into empathy. A lot of people do.
Yeah.
A lot of people. I find it very useful to split empathy off from sympathy this way.
Yeah.
And so... So empathy as an end in itself, or empathy as a means to an end. Okay, validation. The constructionists are into validating experience and the truth content in distortions and delusions. I mean, the intersubjectivists like Stollerow, Atwood, and Brandshaft, when they're dealing with a patient who is psychotic or near psychotic or delusional, their focus is on what's true in the delusion. They're assuming the patient is getting at something true, and they want to emphasize the truth content. A person is saying that people are persecuting me, and their attitude is, well, probably people are, and he's probably getting at something true. May not be the whole truth, but it's important for the therapist to be alert to the truth content in delusions and illusions, and to validate it. Whereas the deconstructionist therapist is interested in invalidating distortions, overcoming self-deception, and enhancing reality testing. So we're less interested in validating the truth content of the distortion than in exposing it as a distortion and helping patients set it aside and face reality. As difficult as facing reality is, which, now of course, the people who, like Stollerow, Atwood, these relational people who are on the first side here, they're into the validation. They look at therapists who are interested in invalidating illusions. They assume that they are authoritarians who arrogantly think that they know what the truth is. And these are analysts who they think consider themselves to have a privileged access to reality. They arrogantly assume they know what's real, and they're interested in helping patients face reality, which these analysts arrogantly assume they know. That's how they're seen by the other school of thought. And actually in Chapter 4 I do quite a critique of Stollerow and so on, because I think they really are making a mistake here. You can be interested in helping patients get beyond illusions and distortions without arrogantly assuming you know what the truth is. In other words, you can be a democratic therapist, not an authoritarian one. So I'm trying to help my patient overcome his illusions, and he's trying to help me overcome mine. And I'm listening to him just as much as he's listening to me. In a really good analysis, sometimes the patient is closer to certain truths than the analyst is. And the analyst better have his ears open to hear, because like patients will sometimes accuse me of some countertransference problem or distortion, and I think about it, and sometimes they're right, and I will then tell them they're right. And we will go from there. We're both interested in invalidating illusions and distortions, but we're not doing it in an authoritarian, one-sided way. We're doing it in a more mutual way. Now, I'm not advocating mutual analysis of the kind that Ferenczi flirted with for a while. I'm not advocating that. I mean, it's... but nevertheless, sometimes the patient corrects my distortions. And sometimes I correct his distortions.
Tom, I have a question.
Sure.
I know that we left Freud with Nietzsche and Marx in the hermeneutics of suspicion category, the doubt category, but I'm thinking about how Marx talked about ruthless critique in a letter to, what was it to? I can't remember right now. And the veil of tears that envelops religion. And I'm thinking about Freud talking about material truth versus historical truth, and how, particularly Moses monotheism, how historical truth is sort of the narrative, material truth is what we understand to be the past and the present. So material truth would be here with doubt, but faith, the distortions that create the myth, the religion, the stories that we tell ourselves, the historical truth, this would be here on the faith side. And I'm just wondering, when it comes to theory, critical theory, Marx, Freud, don't they recognize both as well? Doesn't Freud recognize both?
Material truth. No, we need to characterize our terms here. You're saying, does not Freud recognize the importance of myth?
Yeah, that there's a kernel of truth in it. That's what he writes.
Sure. I think that's true. I mean, again, these two sides of the chart, we do this for analytical purposes, and it's important to see these distinctions analytically, but I'm not at all implying that in the real world we don't encounter mixtures of these things. So I don't think we get a pure illusioning technique or a pure disillusioning technique. I think in the real world we have blends of these things. But I think it's useful to analytically set them out, as Max Weber talked about ideal types. So Max Weber writes about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. And so he tries to describe the Protestant ethic, but he knows he's setting up an ideal type. In the real world, people don't think in these pure categories, but it's useful to have these ideal types. So I'm setting up two ideal types here, illusioning and disillusioning. And I'm not at all saying that Freud and Klein and Lacan are purely on one side and the self-psychology are purely on the other. No, there are crossovers, and certainly Freud had a sense of the truth content in myth, the Oedipus myth. My God. But on the other hand, while there is truth content in the Oedipus myth, Freud is busy trying to help patients disidentify from their projection of Oedipal meanings onto everything. Your boss is not sleeping with your mother or your wife. Your boss is not your father. Your boss is not necessarily out to castrate you. I gave some funny but real examples from my practice in the book. I helped the patient greatly to help him come to understand that his forthcoming doctoral dissertation defense was unlikely to be a gang rape, which is the way he was thinking of it. I mean, I said, you know, they probably are friendly towards you and would like you to pass and wish you well, but he thought he was... then another patient, he had his penis all confused with a cruise missile, which he was very reluctant to launch. Now, of course, why did he think of it as a cruise missile? Because a part of him wanted to kill his mother. And he had rage towards women, and he wanted to destroy them from the inside, and that's why he wasn't going to launch. And then I talked in the book about a patient who had his wife and her lawyers confused with a vampire. For weeks he'd been calling his wife a vampire. And he was a very educated, intelligent man, and I thought he was speaking metaphorically, of course. But then gradually the concrete nature of the metaphor started coming home to me, and I realized he's really into a very concrete fantasy here of his wife as a monster. So I said in one session, but no, she's not a vampire. Oh, but she is... No, she may be like a vampire, but she's not literally a monster. Got the point. She's like a monster, but she's not literally... Well, because you know what you do with vampires. You drive a stake through their heart. That's what you do. Metaphors are bloody dangerous, you know, if you slip into the psychotic literalization. That's what Hannah Siegel distinguishes as symbolic equation versus symbolic representation, right? Well, so what my point is that, yeah, Freud recognized the truth content in myths and metaphors, but he also wanted to work in a deconstructionist way to free us from our myths. It's one thing for us to use a myth and to mine its truth content. It's another thing to be lived by the myth, dominated by it, because we've literalized it, right? I mean, that... I don't know, have I answered your...
Yeah. No, I see how, you know, Freud's sort of throwing, you know, a bucket of cold water on his patients. Like, I think that's perhaps what you're describing here. And we need
trying to wake us up.
Yeah, and maybe what you're suggesting is that's also important to sort of stay in the dream, or to work with the dream, or to work through the dream.
Now, some therapists do. Some therapists, you see, that is the difference between psychoanalysis and the psychoanalyst and the shaman. See, the shaman works within the metaphor, whereas the analyst seeks to deconstruct the metaphor and reveal it as purely a metaphor, as opposed to a literal reality. But shamans, now you see, some analysts have moved towards shamanistic technique, and I gave some examples in the book. So my wife is trained in the School of Modern Analysis, the Spotnitz School, and they do a lot of shamanistic things. They join the resistance, and they sometimes even prescribe the resistance. I don't do this kind of thing, but I realize its power. She does it. She does it extremely well. She does it to me sometimes, with therapeutic effect. But And look, some analytic colleagues get into it. Especially the example I gave in the book is so-called dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality disorder. Some colleagues went a long way towards buying into the patient's dead metaphor, literalized metaphor, that they are multiple. And so that the therapist would say, I want to speak to Miss B now, as if Miss B even exists. Patient believes Miss B exists. But some of the analysts started to believe that Miss B exists. And that's shamanism. You join the patient's metaphor, albeit to therapeutically help them grow out of it. These therapists would say, what you want to do with MPD is help the patient reintegrate. And in order to reintegrate, you may join their metaphor in order to promote integration. Whereas a deconstructionist would say the way to help the patient is to not join the metaphor to help them overcome it, but to deconstruct the metaphor. I see it's only as if you're multiple. I would be very interested in the patient. I see, well, how long have you believed that you have these subcells? Well, this is very interesting. I mean, I'm not throwing cold water. I'm empathically interested in when did this start and how does it work, and tell me all about it. And if the patient says, but do you believe me? Well, I say, of course not. And I'm going to try my best to help you fight free of this delusion. But no, I don't believe it. I insist personally here, my bias is clearly towards the deconstructionist, right, side. But I'm trying to be fair to both, because, but my bias is to be deconstructionist.
What do you think about, for instance, I was thinking of this difference between validating and invalidating.
Yes.
Validation on the self-psychology, relational, intersubjective part.
Yep.
But about the invalidation of...
Thanks for bringing me back to that, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking, for instance, even within that distinction, invalidation, I was thinking the big difference between those kind of invalidation, which are, on the one hand, the ego psychology, which is like you have to correct your, even like cognitive behavioral therapy, like you have to see reality what it is.
Yes.
But on the other hand, you have Lacanians, and Lacan will tell you, well, reality doesn't exist, but you have to disidentify yourself to your illusional ego. You know, and both of them are very, well, I was talked a little bit about Lacan, and they are very critical about the ego psychology.
Yeah.
But at the same time, both are on the same part of invalidating.
Right.
I don't know what you think about.
Well, thank you. That's helpful. I was trying to make the point. You see, the self and relational people, they think that the therapist who invalidates is a big meanie, you know, saying you're wrong, you're out of touch with reality, grow up, face reality. They see this as harsh. And what they're forgetting is that when you were a little kid and you woke up from a nightmare terrified of the boogeyman in the corner or whatever, and your parent came in and turned on a light and said, you see, there's no monster in the corner. That parent is invalidating your fantasy of persecution. That's therapeutic. That's huge relief. I mean, I'm invalidating that patient's fantasy that his doctoral dissertation defense is going to be a gang rape. Well, his anxiety goes down. So invalidating is not necessarily mean. Sometimes it's very kind to invalidate an irrational, terrifying fantasy. Now, of course, we don't stop there. We then want to analyze, why is the patient having that? Why are they doing that to themselves? Where did it come from? We want to analyze the whole thing. But sometimes invalidating a fear can be a kind and relieving thing to do. So I think it's a legitimate analytic technique. I mean, look, patients come and they're depressed. and they're convinced that they're stupid, useless, failures, losers. That's their constant refrain. And I show my deep skepticism of this bullshit. I contradict it. I point to the facts that contradict it. And then I'm saying, well, why do you insist on attacking yourself and painting this all-black picture when clearly it's baloney? Now, I don't expect just saying that's going to cure the patient of it. They have very good grounds for attacking themselves this way. And we need to get to the roots of why they persistently do this to themselves. But I'm invalidating their negative stories. It's not just positive stories that we invalidate, it's negative stories that we invalidate. So I think it's a useful technique, the technique of invalidation.
Yeah, and I understand that, but my question was rather like on the invalidating pole, like contrasting an ego-psychologic versus a Lacanian perspective. Considering the way both see reality, for instance, an ego-psychologist would say, well, you have to adequate your perceptions to what really is.
Yeah.
Like material reality. But a Lacanian would say or would think that reality doesn't exist, or reality is just like a means of the imaginary. So what's important here is to invalidate your illusions about what reality is, you know?
Yeah. Well, this is where I really depart from Lacan. I believe that reality exists. And I believe that science is a way of knowing it. And I think we all know this. Even Lacanians know this. I think if Lacan was going in with a coronary, he would want to have a cardiac surgeon who'd studied in medical school and understood the reality of how the heart operates. I mean, of course reality exists, and science is a way of knowing it, never knowing it completely. I'm a Popperian. I believe that science is a matter of ever closer and closer approximations to an ultimately incompletely knowable reality. Not unknowable, incompletely knowable. We never will know it completely, but we progress. We make progress in science towards knowing better and better. On the other hand, science has its limitations. As I pointed out last week, science can never tell us, it can't deduce an ought from an is. It can describe what is, can't say what ought to be. It has lots of limitations, and in the 20th century, with Heisenberg, Bohr, and Gödel, we came to understand the limits of science. There are paradoxes that can't be resolved. So reason has limits, but nevertheless, reason is extremely valuable and useful, and I believe reality exists, and I believe patients should come to, as much as they can, accommodate themselves to it, painful as reality often is. I think there's truth in that old Freudian fondness for that old cartoon where the guy goes through the adventures and at the end he's always sadder but wiser. Now I think it needs to be supplemented. That's not a good enough description of analysis, sadder but wiser, because it's also happier but wiser. I mean, sometimes an analysis makes you a happier person because it disillusions your depression. Oh, that's an important point I tried to make in the book. If you're into disillusionment, you got to carry it all the way to the point where you become disillusioned with disillusionment. Some people, they get the idea that disillusionment is disillusionment of all of the positive hopes. But we have to become disillusioned with our negative faiths. Nihilism. It's an ism. The idea that there's no truth is an ideological position that needs to be disillusioned. T.S. Eliot put it beautifully. I quoted it somewhere in this chapter. He's talking about disillusion. He's saying how important it is to not rest in disillusion.
Right.
that we have to go on and become disillusioned with disillusionment. That means deconstructing everything. That means being just as skeptical of the negative as of the positive. Crucial. And here again, this connects with Buddhism. Because when you disillusion yourself from all of your positive illusions, and then you also disillusion yourself from your negative illusions, where are you left? What are you left with? That's a very interesting question. I'm left not in depression, because that's a negative illusion. I'm not left in nihilism, because that's an ism. Well, where am I left? I'm somehow left in a place without words.
I think you're left more in a positive space in that case.
Well, maybe
with
you're
hope. Maybe with hope.
Hope, or well, you're left with your being. See, we have trouble just being. I mean, I talked about another last week. The animals are trapped in the now, and we can't ever get into the now for other than a few seconds of grace. I always think of a blues band, and they're playing, and suddenly they're in the groove, and everyone in the room knows they're in the groove, and it's like beautiful, but they only can hold it for a few seconds, and when they lose it, they often start laughing, because they all know they had it, and now it's gone. You can't hold it. Martin Buber gives a beautiful example of this. He grew up on a farm, and his job was to get up at 5 in the morning and go feed the horses. And they had one really wild horse, and this horse would not let you touch it or stroke it or anything. And one morning he's down there feeding, and he's half asleep, and he's stroking the horse. And then he wakes up, and he remembers, oh, this is the horse that you can't stroke, at which course the horse bolts. But until he hit that consciousness, the horse was allowing itself to be stroked, right? So this is Zen. This is kind of Zen. And this thorough disillusionment, even with the negative, puts you in a kind of a Zen state, which I think of this in Winnicottian terms. That's true self. The true self is nothing you can know. Anything you know is not a true self. But Winnicott associates the true self with going on being. That's his phrase, going on being. And he doesn't just mean psychosomatic, biological being. He's talking about something that can happen in play. Like the capacity to be alone, the kid's playing on the carpet, and he loses himself in his play. Now, he's able to lose himself because mother is sitting calmly reading the paper or doing her iPad or knitting, and he wakes up and he's anxious, there she is. He might go over and touch her legs, but then he slides back down, and the reason he can get lost is he doesn't have to hold himself together, because he's being held in the presence, the non-intrusive and non-abandoning presence of the mother. He's feeling held, so he can lose himself. He doesn't have to hold himself. But most of us have trouble. A lot of people have major trouble playing because we're too busy holding ourselves. Mother was intruding, mother was abandoning, whatever. I don't think anyone can just be, but I think that's kind of like the Buddhist goal of meditation, is to be able to bring oneself from time to time into that space of being able to just be and to play. I mean, I don't think there's anything really mystical about it. It means unself-conscious capacity to be and to play. That's mental health. That's true self. But we all need a false self to some degree. We need some armor. We need some masks. Mental health means being able to put the mask aside in a safe space, which is why, again, building a therapeutic alliance with patients, they need to know that this is a fairly safe space. And they can't conclude that from their first few meetings with you. They got to test you, and you have to go through a bunch of stuff, and then gradually they decide, okay, you're an okay guy. This guy seems to like me. He seems to wish me the best. He's on my side. My good side, so I'm going to be able to I'll be able to free associate. Well, it was Hans Sachs said that by the time a patient can free associate, the analysis is over. Because free association is letting go of the masks and the defenses and being able to just spontaneously, it's hard to do. You know? That, well, I haven't studied Fairbairn in a long time, but he thinks that Freud is depersonalizing what is personal when he writes about id forces as if they are somehow not parts other than me, and they rise up and they kick me, you know, and somehow it's not fully me, and Winnicott is busy saying these are parts of the self. This is not. So I think he would share this critique of Freud's idea of the id as the animal, the beast that we're saddled with. I think Fairbairn rejects that kind of thing. Klein never explicitly rejected it, but she just implicitly rejects it. She just doesn't pay any attention to it. She just goes on to describe the conflicts of love and hate rather than talking about anything. And of course, she was very influenced by Fairbairn, right? I mean, that's where she got the schizoid concept. She took that from Fairbairn and made paranoid schizoid positions. So you're right, he's a very important transitional figure there somehow. Yeah. We were talking about the issue of validation and invalidation. And I just remembered, it was the American object relations theorist Arnold Modell, who said that patients come into analysis, and the analyst should be alert to the magical thinking. Many patients, they get hooked up to the wise Dr. Tarnopolsky, and because they're now attached to Dr. Tarnopolsky, they magically slip into thinking that they don't have to be paying attention to their health. They don't have to be worrying about their mortgage. They don't have to worry about their investments because they're connected to the great Dr. Tarnopolsky. And Modell is saying, no knock on Dr. Tarnopolsky, but he's saying, look, you got to pay attention to your health. You got to look after your finances. The mere fact that you're now under the aegis of an admired analyst doesn't mean that you're exempted from reality testing. Wake up. He's saying sometimes the analyst isn't alert to the degree to which the patient has drifted into this magical state, magical thinking. So that's in the spirit of invalidation, you know, the wake-up call, facing reality, which, as I was saying, I do believe exists, and I think we are trying to help patients improve their reality testing. I mean, that I share with the ego psychologists. Provided that I democratize it. Sometimes the patient is helping me with my reality testing in the session. Okay, so below validating and invalidating, different views of what pathology is. On the left-hand side, in the constructionist self, relational, they tend to see pathology as defects, deficits, and developmental arrests. In other words, there are holes in the self, and they conceive these holes as left by bad parenting or inadequate parenting. The parents should have provided something. They didn't. They should have provided self-object function, and they didn't. And now the patient has this defect or this deficit, and they come into therapy, and they're trying to resume development that got arrested because the provision from the parents wasn't there. So now they're trying to resume it with the analyst. So they're placing the analyst in loco parentis. They're trying to get the analyst to provide what the parents didn't. And this is a theory of the therapy as a reparenting process. And I think it's, I'm quite critical of this. I mean, I do believe there's some element of this in every analysis. But when you go overboard with this is a seduction of the analyst's grandiosity. The analyst can get seduced by this. Oh, the mother was so terrible. Well, I'm going to be the better mother. I'm going to provide what's necessary. And you can see how this can go wrong. The analyst is into providing. He's not into analyzing, he's into providing. And he tries to provide, and he tries to provide empathy, and he tries to provide attunement and understanding, and yet the patient isn't getting much better. And the patient is still feeling empty and needy, and what he's providing is not enough. Finally, Kohut offered one patient one finger, was it 2 fingers, to hold on to. So he's violating the no touching boundary. Well, how far is it from 2 fingers to providing a penis? Not far. And this theory can lead therapists into boundary violations. I mean, obviously, the analyst's personality is heavily implicated. Not everyone who works with this theory goes all the way to boundary violations, but the theory is not helping much. It's just, which is not to say the theory is absolutely false. People do have developmental arrests. They were unable to finish certain kinds of development, separation, individuation, whatever. The parents weren't helping, and they do have deficits. But this idea of therapy as reparenting, kind of grandiose on the part of the therapist. I'm not so grandiose as that. All I can do is try to help the person work towards some insight. Now, of course, I do try to be a decent, warm, and kind human being. And that's therapeutic. That helps them, for sure. For sure it helps them. But they're in charge. They're going to have to change their way of living. They're going to have to overcome. Okay, so look how the deconstructionist approach is this. Okay. Pathology not seen so much as deficit and defect, but as conflict and distortion. The pathology is conflict. The patient comes with conflicts that need to somehow get resolved. First of all, recognized, and then hopefully move towards some kind of resolution. And distortion. Patient comes with distorting fantasies. This again is especially the Kleinian perspective that I find so helpful. Fantasy spelt PH, unconscious fantasies. The patient is, we are all walking around with fantasies. And this is not the kind of wish-fulfilling fantasy. Freud had a narrower concept of what fantasy is. I mean, if you can't have something in reality, you have a fantasy. And you give yourself in fantasy what you didn't get in reality. That's a kind of a compensating fantasy. But Klein uses fantasy really to mean a worldview. Your way of understanding what reality and yourself. Fantasies about other people, fantasies about yourself, fantasies about what's going on. Now, the Kleinian concept of fantasy is very close to what sociologists mean by definition of the situation. Sociologists, social psychologists say we move through life by defining situations. And we act on the basis of our definition of the situation, which may be out of touch with reality. I always gave the example of a guy, 2 people are driving at night, and the guy at the wheel is a Canadian, and they're driving in the southwest U.S., and suddenly a round spherical object is right there in the middle of the road, and the Canadian is going to turn the car over or crash because he's swerving to avoid it, but the native of New Mexico grabs the wheel and drives right into it, because he defines that thing as tumbleweed. Canadian thinks it's a boulder in the middle of the road. Doesn't matter what the thing is, if you're interested in understanding their different behavior, because they have different definitions of the situation. We act on the basis of our definitions of the situation. Klein would say, fantasies. So what is psychoanalysis? It's the analysis of our fantasies. Because for Klein, the mind is really a tissue of fantasies. That's what the mind is. It's a tissue of fantasies. And people don't often recognize that for Melanie Klein, there's no such thing as what the Freudian ego psychologists call defense mechanisms. These are fantasies. So projective identification is not a real thing. Projective identification is my fantasy that a bit of me is now in you. Or it's my fantasy that a bit of you is now in me. Now that has real consequences. I mean, if I act on the basis of my fantasy that a bit of me is now in you, I conduct myself towards you in a way that sometimes makes you actually start to experience the very thing I'm in my fantasy attributing to you. So the example I always use is the patient comes in and looks at me and says, "Whoa, what's with you? Wrong side of the bed?" What? Well, boy, you're obviously in a bad mood this morning. Really? Well, it's obvious. Look how you just answered me. Now I'm starting to get angry. Projective identification. Okay, so the mind is a system of fantasies, and analysis is becoming acquainted with our fantasies. Like most men, I think, or many men, I used to suffer from the fantasy of the frightening, phallic, pre-Oedipal mother, the woman, the scary woman. I was chairman of my department at the university, and we had a hiring to do, and there was 1 man and 4 women, and we all wanted a woman because many of our students are women, and we needed role models. The university hadn't quite come in with the affirmative action for women, but the one guy was so superior to the 4 women, academically. Everyone would agree, on academic grounds, he was just superior. I was praying that the department wouldn't split, because I would not have to vote as chair. The department split, 4 for the woman, 4 for the man. I had to cast the vote. I hired the guy. The head of women's studies was a scary, phallic woman, even with the Medusa hair. And, you know, like in Greek mythology, Athena had the head of the Medusa painted on her shield. And if she held up the shield, men would look at this snake hair and they would drop their spears and run, because as Freud says, the multiplication of penises stands for no penis at all. So it's a big castration threat. And this woman went to town at the university, attacking me, attacking the guy I hired, and this went on for years. Finally, I got him hired. But then, when he was going forward for tenure, the whole thing flared up again and had to be fought through. He turned out to be one of the best hires of the university. He was a tremendous, he supervised hundreds of PhD theses during his career. He was a great hire. One of the best things I accomplished as an academic was hiring this guy, but what a fight. Anyway, I was in analysis. And so, all of this did me the favor of putting my fear of the phallic mother. I had to deal with it. And I successfully overcame it. I have learned that women are simply people.
Just like men.
And so there's good ones and bad ones and indifferent ones, and they come in all, you know, and so if they're bad and scary, so what? You know, you just deal with it. I'd always been able to protect myself against manipulative men. Now I can protect myself against manipulative women now too. But boy, what a struggle. It's a very common problem. I encountered this with a lot of male patients. They know how to deal in business and protect themselves from men, but when they're up against a sociopathic woman, she has them for breakfast. You know? That was a fantasy that I managed to finally deal with. Okay, so the pathology as a pathogenic absence on the one side, something missing, whereas for the Freudian and Kleinian, the pathology is a pathogenic presence. It's not just something missing, it's something there in the psyche, like a fantasy, like my fantasy of the scary phallic woman. That's a presence in my psyche that needed to be analyzed and invalidated and overcome. Presences rather than absences. Okay, the technique.
Well, what would be like how would you characterize that pathogenic as an absence?
Well, the
over in the dialectics, like what you were just talking about.
That particular example of like the phallic woman.
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't. I mean, I'm not saying that a man is missing something if he doesn't have that phallic woman in his mind, or okay, maybe he has it in his mind.
He's learned. Absence of a positive.
Would be the absence of a positive, nurturing view.
Right.
Or it might be that he's got too much of a positive, nurturing view to compensate and defend against an underlying fearful view of her as an attacker.
Manipulative or whatever.
Yeah, so look, there's a perfect example of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, like a lot of men of his time, put women on a pedestal. He visited his mother. She was in his 70s. He was still going to see her every Saturday or Sunday morning. And according to Deborah Margolis, who wrote a whole book, Freud and His Mother, the evidence is he hated his mother, but he could never admit it. He had a big defense against his hatred of his mother. She was narcissistic. Her attitude was, my son, the great Sigmund Freud, who, she derived narcissistic pleasure through his, so did she even love him for himself? Or just for his great, but he, as a defense against knowing that he hated her, he kept her on a pedestal. He, like all sexist men, he tended to put women on a pedestal, which is belittling to them. He also saw them as castrated men. He fell into a concretized fantasy there. Women are not castrated men. They may be like a castrated man in the sense that there's a missing penis, but that doesn't make them a castrated man. I'm not sure whether I'm answering your question.
I really object to that when I hear, and you've said it repeatedly in the years that I've known you, there's a missing penis. What about for a man there's a missing vulva?
Oh, of course. And a missing womb.
Yes.
A missing capacity to be able to give birth to a child. Yes, of course. There's much. I don't mean to say that there's nothing missing in men, but women do often have the idea. It's hard in this culture. Maybe it's hard in every culture, I don't know, but it's hard for a woman to escape the idea, or for men to escape the idea, that there's a missing penis. What is the obstetrician, he looks between the legs of the child when it comes out. Is there a penis or isn't there?
Well, that's just to determine sex.
Well, to determine sex, but look at the language. Is there a penis there or isn't there? He's not saying, is there a vulva there or isn't there? He's saying, is there a penis there or isn't there? The culture is biased in this way. Don't kill the messenger.
You've got some of my anger there.
Well, no, I'm not angry, but I'm just saying.
No, I said you got some of mine.
Well, yeah, of course, killing the messenger, because I'm reporting that this is a culture which tends to think on some level of women as missing something, and it's irrational.
It is totally.
Of course, and it's very clear in Freud. He goes on to say, when the little girl discovers that she lacks a penis, i.e., when she discovers her castration, he says, as if he's saying the same thing, as if learning that you don't have a penis is discovering your castration. No. You're just discovering you don't have a penis, but that doesn't make you castrated. Or it oughtn't to. It may form the fantasy that you're castrated, but that's just a fantasy. It's not a reality. The little girl is not castrated.
I've never had that fantasy.
What's that?
Honestly, I've never had that fantasy.
A lot of women don't. A lot of women do on some level and then resolutely don't on another level. I mean, you know, I'm not presuming to interpret you, but all I'm saying is that some women who think this is a bizarre fantasy I've never had, it's because they've had it. And they've buried it deeply, and they don't want to, you know, go near it.
So what if they didn't bury it deeply?
Well, I'm not assuming all women have had it. I'm not generalizing like that. Freud did, but I'm not generalizing like that.
Don, you were always helpful in the courses I took with you when you replaced penis envy with thinking about the phallus, and the Lacanian phallus is something symbolic.
Yes.
That the little girl knows that there's something missing. It's not a penis, it's power.
Power.
Yes.
Right. Yes, and yeah. Right, the phallus, that's a great contribution by Lacan. That the phallus is that which mother desires, and I want not to have a phallus, I want to be the phallus for the mother. That is, I want to be the apple of mother's eye. I want to be what mother desires. I want to be able to complete her. And I don't want to share her look with anyone. I want to fulfill her entirely. And if I'm stuck on that, I'm a pervert. Lacan refers to the two cuts. First of all, the person has to have the cut between fantasy and reality, inner and outer, self and other. That's the first castration, the first cut. And if you don't make that, you're psychotic. But if you manage to do that, you then have to do the second cut and realize I cannot be the phallus for the mother. I'm not, and I can't be. And that's Father's job, to perform that castration. And if Father doesn't perform it, I'm stuck with having to perform it myself. For the rest of my life, I'm having to be self-castrated. Freudians would talk about that as an Oedipal victory. And I have to spend the rest of my life punishing myself for this Oedipal victory, being the phallus for the mother. Yeah. Phallus, not penis.
I think that may be related to patriarchy. For instance, Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, the French sociologist, he refers to psychoanalysis and phallic logic as being inherently patriarchal, like phallocentric, and related to the difference of sexes and difference of labor related to sexes. So I think it's very interesting to think that the Oedipus complex always reflects like a way of organizing sexes into the culture.
Yes, right. But you have to talk about the different schools of psychoanalysis. I mean, Freud really had very little to say about mothers other than as targets of Oedipal desire. He had very little to say. Klein really puts the mother on the map and makes the so-called pre-Oedipal. Of course, there really is no pre-Oedipal for Klein, because she takes the Oedipus complex right back into the first year of life. I mean, you know, Freud doesn't see the Oedipus complex till 2.5 to 5 or 6. Klein brings it much earlier. But post-Freudian psychoanalysis is moving against the patriarchy and reminding us of the matriarchy. I mean, I think a lot of Freudians are very father-identified people. I think, you know, you have to ask about a male who becomes Kleinian. Why did you choose the mother of psychoanalysis over the father? I certainly did. I chose the mother of psychoanalysis over the father because I'm both. I greatly respect Freud, but I mean, I'm very aware of his defects and flaws and things left out, and Mrs. Klein fills in tremendously. Lacan, like Freud, is patriarchal. It's all about paternal function. There's no maternal function in Lacan. Yeah.
Well, I've been thinking about that because you've been saying that for a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And where do you put the petit a? I mean, this is really where Lacan's signal discovery and
signals
discovery, or a contribution apart from the phallus.
Petit a meaning autre, the other.
Yeah, the little other.
Yeah.
The little other.
As opposed to the big other of the symbolic.
Yeah, so we can't, I mean, I don't know that we want to go there, but the big other is the father, is a sort of, there's a superego type of voice.
Yeah.
And the petit a, the little, is the object cause of my desire.
Right.
So that there's, I think, some kind of a sense of the sublimation of the maternal, or the sublimation. I mean, I don't think.
Well, I don't know that you can say that. I mean, look, the petit a is other,
right.
and but he doesn't do much to identify that with the mother. You can go. You can do that. You can go there. He gives you that opening.
Yeah, I did. Other.
Well, yeah, it doesn't seem to be a huge theme. It's at best, I think it's a rather subordinate theme. I mean, if you look at the whole tapestry of Lacanian theory, there's so much about paternal function, and the castration, and the law, and that's predominant. There is this opening.
Well, I mean, it's not. I mean, that is his main theory. About
it is
the object cause of desire. I haven't thought it through.
Yeah.
But it just seems to me, and of course, all sexuation, sort of modern sexuation, is all Lacanian based. I mean, it's sexuation and the feminine jouissance. The jouissance of this other jouissance, which is not phallic jouissance.
Right.
I think it's related to the maternal, 100%.
Well, okay, the opening is there.
Yeah, there's a whole, and that is huge in Lacanian theory, and I think it's really.
But subordinate, very subordinate to the emphasis on the paternal. It's there, but it's subordinate. And besides. It's not the same thing as the post-Freudian discovery of the maternal, not just as not just in terms of gender, not just as this category, but the mother as a breast, the mother as a nurturer, the mother as a holding, containing. This is not there in Lacan, nowhere near. Wilfred Bion's whole theory of the pathology is that the mother contains the distress of the infant. The infant is projecting his beta elements, his distress. He's projecting it into the mother, and the mother is in a state of reverie, and if she's operating well, she's containing it, and she's processing it, and she's processing it into fantasy, and then she's giving it back in a detoxified form to the infant. And if she fails at this, if she can't contain it, and she just reprojects it, then the child is persecuted in a persecutory state. There's a whole element on the mother soothing. It's not there in Lacanian theory. And to me, this is so crucial. Because this containing mother, this soothing mother, this is the basis of conscience. She's loving and feeding and keeping us alive, and we're kept alive by her love. And therefore we learn what love is. And we acquire the need to love her back. And so we need to give love to others, because others have loved us. And this is so important. We're no longer in the world of men and law. Women are about something other than the law, the paternal law. I think we do well to heed these reports. Like, people tell us that men who are dying on the battlefield are calling for their mommies. That's profound. Yeah. And that's conscience. That's where conscience comes from. Crucial, it seems to me. Okay, so look, working within the metaphor or the fantasy, we've talked about that. Working within the metaphor. A lot of the self-relational intersubjective people, they're very reluctant to challenge the patient's metaphors and fantasies. That they see as invalidating. They won't. Stollerow and those people, they reject the concept of resistance. They say that if the analyst feels that the patient is in a state of resistance, that is nothing more than the analyst revealing he's got a countertransference problem. Because if the analyst did not have a countertransference problem, he would not be thinking the patient is resisting. Because if he didn't have a countertransference problem, he'd be in empathic attunement with the patient. And he would not see the patient as resisting. Now that's a very one-sided view. I don't accept that at all. Patients resist. And that's a fact. And it's not just a countertransference problem, and we work with resistance. How do we do it? We don't scold people for resistance, but we call attention to the fact that they're resisting. Do you notice that every time we get on this subject, you change the subject? Have you noticed? Obviously, this is a difficult subject for you. Do you notice that whenever we talk about this, you don't remember anything in the next session? Where does it go? Why does it go? I mean, I think the ego psychologists have got a point. A psychoanalysis as resistance analysis. I think that's a big part of what analysis is. You know, being attentive to the resistances. And drawing the patient's attention to them. So, as opposed to working within the metaphor or fantasy, it's working outside the metaphor or fantasy. Calling attention to the fact that, my God, you seem to take this metaphor literally. You speak of this quite literally, as if it's really true. That your boss is out to get you. Now, sometimes bosses are out to get us, but often we think they are, and they're not. That's a fantasy. That needs to be challenged, it seems to me. Therapy as provision versus therapy as analysis. Treating the child within. Self-relational. Treating the child within. From a more Kleinian Freudian point of view, it's about deconstructing the fantasy that there is a child within. That often gets quite literalized. This can be literalized too by Freudians, that there's a child within. And what's an analysis is getting to know the child within. I would never say that. I would say that analysis is me getting to know my fantasy that there's a child within. I'm not a child anymore. I'm 75 years of age, for God's sake. There's no child within. But I can sometimes succumb to the fantasy that I'm still a child. I can actually get into it and even enjoy pretending I'm a child again. And I can certainly enjoy pretending I'm a child again and being mothered. That's nice. But it's a fantasy. I'm not a child. And my wife is not my mother. Although sometimes it's fun to think that she is. So it's really, deconstructing the fantasy that there's a child within.
But this is very potent in the last 20 years. But that is a man named John Bradshaw.
Oh, yes.
May 9. And I've actually had the experience of working with several clients who had a run of inner child work.
Yes.
And, well, it didn't work for me because I couldn't really accept the notion, which is unrelentingly accepting and taking everything as totally true.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, good for you. Your skepticism prevented you. Now, if you had been able to get into it, it might have soothed you in various ways. There are lots of ways there are lots of forms of therapy that are not truth therapy. Okay, Robert Langs wrote a paper back in the 1970s. People hated it. They called it too dualistic and oversimplified, but I loved it. I thought it was just dead on. It was called Truth Therapy, Lie Therapy. Truth Therapy / Lie Therapy. Robert Langs, Langs, New York analyst. He was quite fanatical in a lot of ways that I didn't like, but with that, he wrote some wonderful papers, and he sure knew how to listen with the third ear to the unconscious. But anyway, he says there's many ways of sorting different therapies out. Dynamic, supportive, whatever. But he says the fundamental distinction, is it a truth therapy or is it a lie therapy? And he saw a role for lie therapy. Sometimes certain patients just cannot face the truth, and there's no point in trying. They won't, they can't. Well, if a lie therapy prevents them from jumping in front of the subway all the time, let's give them lie therapy. A lie therapy could be psychopharmacology. I mean, there's nothing being cured, but symptoms are being relieved, and the patient is surviving, and they're less despairing, and they're not so suicidal, but it's not a truth therapy. Psychoanalysis, Freud wanted psychoanalysis to be a truth therapy. A therapy that comes through facing often uncomfortable truths. Yeah.
Don,
yeah.
Just really quickly, what of the traumatized child, the adult who has deadened parts of themselves? You know, the brain stops growing with, trauma that occurs in childhood. And there's a child still within. Is that the same as it, or not?
Well, I can't speak about parts of the brain stopping growing. I mean, you're into neuropsychoanalysis there, and I really don't know anything about that, nor do I really wish to know anything about it. It's just not my thing. I'm interested in the mind, not the brain. I realize we have to have a brain in order to have a mind. That I know. I often quip, that's a no-brainer. We need to have a brain in order to have a mind, but look, trauma is really difficult, and it's a whole other kettle of fish, as Ferenczi noted in that great paper about the conflict of tongues between the adult and the child. I mean, here he is. He's got the psychoanalysis is about putting everything into words, say everything. His patients have been traumatized. He's pressuring them to say, and they're telling him, "You're so cruel. You're torturing me, Dr. Ferenczi. Don't you understand that if I talk about my trauma, I have to go home to bed for 3 days? I can't go to work, and you're making me talk about it. You're so cruel." Ferenczi kind of wakes up and says, "Oh, well, maybe they're right. Maybe I am being cruel. Maybe the psychoanalytic method of getting them to talk about it, pressing them to talk about it, maybe this doesn't work with these kinds of patients. At least not at the beginning. We have to do something else." I think he's right about that. Trauma is different. So where you're dealing with trauma, I think this is an example where holding environment, containing, this is where cohood and empathy and not pressuring to deconstruct, maybe for long periods of time. But I think ultimately, if there's going to be an analytic cure, well, you know what? I don't even know. I think I'm still shifting ground on this. Help patients resume arrested development toward adulthood through a process of reparenting by the therapist in loco parentis. I've talked about what I think are the dangers of that, as opposed to promoting recognition by patients that they are adults and that their therapists Are there more or less competent employees? I mean, because that's what I am. The patient is employing me, like they employ a plumber. I have some knowledge, and they want my knowledge to help them unplug themselves. And so at the bottom we have imaginary and symbolic. There's the Lacanian categories. I mean, I think that the constructionist approach is taking place on the level of the imaginary. And I think that the deconstructionist approach is taking place on the level of the symbolic. But as I say in the book, when I presented this many years ago, there was a very smart young woman in that seminar who said to me, I think that you are clearly biased towards the deconstructionist approach, and your deconstructionist bias needs deconstruction. And I said, well, you're quite right. That is my bias, and thank you for pointing it out. And in pointing it out, you have just shared my bias, because you are opting for deconstruction. Right? So, but deconstructing the bias is real. It's not just, I mean, it's recognition that we do need this left side of the chart. We do need to do these things.
There's that nice distinction that Heidegger insisted on in his early work, the difference between Vorsorge and Sorge. The Fürsorge is, I think, words are the anxious provision to help people. And he says, snarkily, similar to the work of a social worker.
Yeah.
And Sorge means one of his wonderfully old news rehashed words, meant Sorge, meaning concernful care and benevolent attitude, but it wasn't a doing of something.
Right.
And this is quite interesting. It just strikes me that in a way that if you look at these two things,
right,
they represent pretty much those two different categories.
Yes, and people overly committed to the doing something think that people who are operating from that other point of view are passive, cold, and uncaring. And that's not true at all. I mean...
severe, difficult.
Yeah, that's
like
how...
the Latin teacher, Mr. Marcus, when I studied with him in high school, but he meant a huge... he was so good.
Right.
In aftermath, you know?
Right, right. So there's the stereotyping, and I thought, look, the stereotypes flow both ways. People like me who are clearly more oriented towards the deconstruction, we stereotype the self and relational people and turn them into nothing but social workers, okay? As if being a social worker is a bad thing. There's a world for social workers, but actually it reminds me that a big part, my wife always tells me about during her analytic training, she was presenting a case, and Dr. Love was his name. And he said, look, you got to decide. You want to be an analyst or do you want to be a social worker? That really hit home with her. She opted for analyst rather than social worker. Yeah.